Starting last month, victims of violent crime across the country have been getting letters telling them those who changed their lives forever may be released early as part of the government's early prisoner release scheme.
Hi everyone, nice to see you.
Andy Burnham, on his fourth day as Prime Minister, has announced he is pausing that scheme and said no prisoner will be let out until he's convinced risks are minimised. One victim, who's been informed the man who raped her when she was 14 could be released early, welcomed the pause.
I'm so relieved that he has put the pause on it, and I'm very thankful that he's done this, but now we need to change it and make sure that violent sexual predators and criminals aren't allowed back out in regards to the early release scheme. There's something is still going to have to go ahead, I believe, but he needs to be looking at the lesser offenders and not violent criminals.
Labour, when they won the election, inherited a crisis in prison places. And after an emergency early release scheme, a year later produced a wider, more permanent early release law.
Clear the lobby!
This was the vote at second reading last year. Not one Labour MP voted against the new law, now being questioned by a newly elected Labour MP, and as of Monday, Prime Minister Andy Burnham.
It is right, and it's right for victims and survivors to challenge us on this, to make sure that people, that they know when or if their perpetrator might be leaving prison and under what criteria, and that's why we're looking again.
So you didn't raise this before, though, did you?
This wasn't something that I'd raised personally in that, but nevertheless, with a new Prime Minister, he, with me as his new Lord Chancellor, has quite rightly seen something that's very significant. We're having another look at it because we want to get it right for victims.
Prison governors say they're already at full stretch trying to calculate correct sentence adjustments and don't relish the idea of dealing with hundreds, perhaps thousands of prisoners whose expectations of early release have been dashed.
I think there will be a sense of chaos in some prisons as a result of this announcement because calculations and preparations have been done for the launch of this scheme in September, with some prisoners coming out that month. I think that the figure was around about 700 and then the same number every month over the following months. I am staggered that the government, when it drew up this scheme, didn't exclude certain categories of offender. For example, those convicted of manslaughter, rape, grievous bodily harm and death by driving offences. I think that was a terrible blunder not to do that.
Labour ministers had claimed to have balanced the concerns of victims with the pressures on crowded prisons. Their new boss is remarking their work. Well, we don't know how long an urgent review takes in the new government. It's quite a challenge to get this done in a few short weeks in August, say, given the creakiness of the prison system. It could be that Andy Burnham decides he wants to put the brakes on the entire release scheme, and so nobody comes out after the 2nd of September, and the whole review goes on much longer. But the prison capacity is at about 97% at the moment. We know prisons are extremely crowded. Those numbers can go up very quickly, and you could be back in a different sort of problem with prison riots and other concerns very quickly. If Andy Burnham decided that actually the approach he wanted to take was to remove certain cohorts of offenders, violent offenders, say, particularly violent offences, out of this early release scheme, well, experts say in those circumstances you probably need to change the actual law, which was passed only as recently as the beginning of this year. Parliament's not sitting. You'd have to wait for Parliament to come back. That could be a complicated procedure. It is all an incredibly difficult area that Andy Burnham has decided to throw the spotlight on. I suspect he feels, he talked about this in his by-election, that where things were going wouldn't pass the Makerfield test, the sort of sniff test of voters that he encounters there. And he was concerned to head that off, but he's thrown the spotlight on a policy area which all politicians of all parties have found incredibly difficult to resolve.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster, thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier I spoke to Jake Richards, who was reconfirmed in his job as a Justice Minister only this afternoon. Just a few weeks ago, in a parliamentary debate, he was adamant that early release needed to happen to save the prison system from chaos. I asked him what had changed his mind.
Well, Matt, on the 7th of July, which is the parliamentary debate that I'm pleased you've rewatched, I made it very clear that the Prime Minister then, just as the Prime Minister now, would always have to balance two things. They have to balance public safety, which is the absolute priority, and ensuring that we keep the public safe, that victims have confidence in the system, but also ensuring, as part of that, that we have a functioning prison system. Now, that is a balance that any Prime Minister, any Justice Secretary, and indeed any Justice Minister has to strike. Now, that is something which moves as time moves on. It's a relatively fluid situation. And of course it's right that a new Prime Minister and Justice Secretary look at that again. We haven't implemented these measures. They're coming into force later in the year. And so we have some time to look at it again and make sure we're getting it right.
But the impression one gets from this pretty dramatic reversal of policy, and I know it's only day 4 on the job for the new government, although not for you because you've been there for some time. The impression one gets is that it's chaotic.
Well, no, Matt, to be honest, what would be much more chaotic is rushing something through without consistently reassessing, making sure it's right, making sure we treat these really sensitive, important policy issues with the care.
But that's what you were prepared to do just a few weeks ago.
No, but Matt, as I said in the House of Commons, you've watched my debate. I'm pleased you've watched it, and you would have heard me say that any government, responsible government, would of course keep these measures under review and assess them before they're being implemented. That's absolutely right. Do we have to take steps to ensure we have a functioning prison system? Yes. Do we have to keep those steps under review to make sure they're keeping the public safe? Yes. That's what this government is doing. That's what this Prime Minister is doing. And that's what I will do as a minister that serves to him.
This programme has spoken to, quite a few women who were victims of terrible crimes, who were terrified about the early release. They have been put through the mill because of the government's policy that has now been reversed. Would you like to apologise to them on behalf of the government for having subjected them to this kind of anguish?
Well, Matt, firstly, look, I take it incredibly seriously. I meet with victims as part of my job on a daily basis. And before I was an MP, before the last general election, I worked with victims across the country of some of the most serious offences. So I understand how difficult this is. But I cannot look victims in the eye as well and tell them that we are willing to put our head in the sand and risk a prison system collapsing. And if a prison system collapsing, the people who will lose out the most are victims of crime. So we cannot risk that.
And so by your own logic, the prison system, which we know, has a legacy of overcrowding and underfunding, is still perilously close to collapse, as you have warned us in the past. So what are you going to do about it now? Well, how are you going to prevent the system from collapsing without the early release?
Well, Matt, first of all, let's not preempt the review of the policy and the review of these implementation steps that are coming later in the year. But what this government is actually doing is building more prisons. So in the first 2 years of this Labour government...
And how long will that take?
Well, just bear with me, Matt. In the first 2 years, we've built 3,200 places. We're going to get up to 14,000 places by 2030. I just want to put that into context for your viewers. Under 14 years of Conservative government, they managed just 500 places. We've managed to stabilise the prison system over the last 2 years. Your viewers will no doubt remember the scenes in the summer of 2024 where prisons were literally bursting. We had only a few places left. Now, that is incredibly dangerous. That means that police might not be able to make arrests, that the courts would have to stop trying cases. We stabilise the system, but to make it sustainable for the long term will mean difficult decisions.
And of course, one of the solutions to the overcrowding is the tagging of prisoners when they're released from the prison system. Is that actually going to work?
We are working at pace with our contractors and others who implement that scheme to ensure that it's as robust as possible. Now, there is still much more work to be done. I'm not pretending that system is perfect.
Because the evidence suggests the evidence suggests that the tagging is not working properly at the moment.
At times, it's not working well enough, and I completely accept that. And we've got to get to work to get a grip of it, and that's part of what, no doubt, the Ministry of Justice and the relevant ministers will be undertaking over the summer.
Jake Richards, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt.
Well, joining me now is Sarah Wilson, who was groomed and sexually abused as a child by a group of men in Rotherham. One of them was sentenced to 20 years only 4 months ago, but in June she got a letter saying that 2 of her perpetrators could be considered for early release. Sarah, thank you very much for coming on the programme. You've been through a really, really tough period after you received that letter from the Ministry of Justice about the early release. How do you feel today after the announcement that the whole thing would be paused?
Although I welcome Andy Burnham Burnham's statement, it doesn't change anything for victims and survivors all up and down our country. For the last 4 weeks or so, we've been tormented with this information. It just gives us more time to fight for our basic human rights.
So what would you like to hear from the government that you haven't heard yet?
That they will definitely exempt dangerous offenders from this new prison release scheme. They shouldn't have even been considered. I'd rather a thief on the street than a dangerous predator or a dangerous individual.
I mean, it is amazing to consider that, you know, two of the perpetrators, you know, who committed crimes against you were only sentenced, you know, a few months ago, and that they might be part of this early release scheme. Astonishing,
They are
really.
They are part of this early release scheme. My victim support officer rang me and told me that these two perpetrators was actually under this new release scheme.
And tell me about the anguish that you've been feeling ever since you got that letter.
My anxiety is 100%. I feel tormented. I feel like I've just had a brick chucked in my face. I feel like fighting for justice wasn't worth it. I fought for 11 years to get these abusers put behind bars. And if this new law comes into power, they will only serve 5 and 6 years. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it's not fair.
So you feel that your fight, your crusade for justice was a waste of time?
Yes, absolutely. If I'd have known this information, I wouldn't have put myself through numerous, and I mean numerous, hours and hours of video interviews identifying these perpetrators. I wouldn't have put myself through extra trauma for them to only get a slap on the wrist. It wouldn't have been worth it.
And I guess the insecurity now for you is that even though this has been delayed and paused, we don't actually know for how long.
No, we don't. It just means us survivors and victims have just got a little bit of extra time to fight for our basic human rights. I mean, for it to even be considered is absolutely mind-blowing. You know, we're not talking about someone who's gone into a shop and stole a 50p chocolate bar. We're talking about abusers. We're talking about manslaughter. We're talking about paedophiles.
And yet the government, of course, the previous government, also this government, is saying we have a massive problem in the prison system. There's, you know, gross overcrowding. We have to solve it, and one of the ways to do that is to release people early. Do you understand their argument when they say that?
No, not at all. I understand releasing prisoners for petty crimes and some hurty words, but I don't understand dangerous offenders. No matter how long they've already been in prison, I will never understand that.
Sarah Wilson, thank you very much for coming on the programme. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.